Naveen stood on the rooftop of his family's modest apartment, staring out over the sprawling skyline of New Delhi. His chest ached from the weight of expectation. Born into a conservative Indian family, Naveen's life had always been meticulously planned, from his education to his future career in engineering and even to the woman he was supposed to marry. But Naveen harbored a secret, one he had buried so deeply that it only surfaced in the quiet of his solitude. A chance scholarship had brought him to an international university in London, and that was where he first encountered Elias. Elias was a stark contrast to Naveen. He was Norwegian, with blonde hair that caught the sunlight like strands of gold, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through every facade. While Naveen was reserved and cautious, Elias was bold, outspoken, and unapologetically himself. The two had been paired together for a group project, and their initial interactions had been polite but distant. Elias's jokes would often fall flat against Naveen's stoic demeanor, and Naveen's quiet intelligence was met with Elias's exasperated, "You've got to loosen up, man." But over time, something shifted. Late-night study sessions turned into long conversations about their dreams and fears. Elias spoke of growing up in a society that prided itself on openness, but where he still felt like an outsider for being gay. Naveen, in turn, confessed his struggles with the expectations of his family and culture, though he left out the part about his own confusing feelings toward men. One night, after a particularly grueling day of exams, Elias's casual brush of Naveen's hand sent a jolt through him. Naveen pulled away, his heart racing, but Elias's expression, a mix of surprise and something deeper, stayed with him for days. Their friendship deepened over time, but it wasn't without its challenges. Naveen's reluctance to let go of his tightly guarded reserve often frustrated Elias, who couldn't comprehend why someone so brilliant, so compassionate, would choose to cage himself within walls built by others. One chilly evening, as they walked along the edge of the park, Elias couldn't hold back his thoughts any longer. The moonlight painted silver streaks on the path ahead, but the tension between them loomed darker than the night. "You're not living your life, Naveen," Elias said suddenly, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. He stopped walking and turned to face his friend, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're just surviving it." Naveen froze, caught off guard by the raw emotion in Elias's voice. For a moment he said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Then, after a long pause, his shoulders stiffened, and his response came, sharp and defensive. "You don't understand," Naveen retorted, his tone colder than the wind biting at their faces. "You've never had to choose between yourself and your family. It's not as simple as you think." Elias's jaw clenched as his emotions bubbled to the surface. His voice rose, louder than he intended. "Haven't I? Do you think coming out was easy for me? Do you think my parents didn't struggle to accept me? I had to fight for every bit of understanding, Naveen, but at least I gave them the chance to know who I really am. Can you say the same?" Naveen flinched, as if Elias's words had struck a nerve. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Both of them stood there, staring at each other, neither willing to back down. Elias's shoulders sagged first, the fight draining out of him. "I'm saying this because I care about you, Naveen, more than you probably realize, and it kills me to watch you hide the best parts of yourself." But Naveen couldn't respond. His chest tightened with a mix of anger, fear, and something he didn't dare name. Instead, he muttered, "I need to go," and walked away, leaving Elias standing alone under the pale glow of the moon. The argument left them both shaken. Days turned into weeks, and the once constant stream of texts and late-night calls between them dwindled to nothing. Naveen threw himself into his studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if immersing himself in work could drown out the ache Elias had left behind. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the void was there, growing larger and more unbearable with each passing day. Late one night, as Naveen sat alone in his room, his textbook spread out before him, he found himself staring blankly at the words on the page. His mind refused to focus. Memories of Elias, his laugh, the warmth in his eyes, the way he always seemed to know exactly what Naveen needed to hear, kept invading his thoughts. And then it hit him like a thunderclap. He didn't just miss Elias's friendship. It was something deeper, something he had been too scared to admit even to himself. He cared for Elias in a way he had never cared for anyone before. The realization left him breathless, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to sit with the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. Elias wasn't just a friend. He was the one person who had seen him for who he truly was, and maybe even loved him for it. But had he lost his chance to tell him? The first time Naveen kissed Elias, it was on the rooftop of their university dormitory, under a sky full of stars. They had sneaked up there after a late-night study session, turned into an impromptu conversation about dreams and fears. Naveen remembered the way Elias's dark curls caught the moonlight, the faint flush on his cheeks when he laughed. It wasn't planned, but as Elias turned to him, his eyes wide with curiosity and something more, Naveen felt an unexplainable pull. It was hesitant, awkward, and perfect. Their lips barely brushed at first, a shy connection that deepened when Elias leaned in, bolder now, as if answering an unspoken question. The air seemed to still around them, the noise of the city below fading into the background. When they finally pulled apart, Elias's laughter, soft and full of wonder, broke the silence. It melted the last of Naveen's defenses. For the first time in years, Naveen felt like he could breathe freely. But their happiness was short-lived. When Naveen's father fell ill, he was forced to return to India. The separation was agonizing, and though they promised to stay in touch, nothing could fill the void of being apart. Naveen called Elias late at night, their whispered conversations stretching into the early hours, but the distance was relentless. Naveen tried to stay strong, reassuring Elias that he would come back. He didn't want to admit how suffocating the walls of his family home had become, how the pressure to be the perfect son weighed heavier every day. Then it happened. An ill-timed message from Elias, "I miss you," popped up on Naveen's phone during a family dinner. He didn't notice it at first, too focused on avoiding his father's probing questions about his career plans. But his mother did. Her sharp gasp drew everyone's attention, and before Naveen could react, his father snatched the phone off the table. "What is this?" his father demanded, his voice cold and dangerous. Naveen's stomach dropped as he saw the message glaring back at him. He tried to snatch the phone back, but his father held it out of reach. "Explain yourself!" "It's nothing," Naveen stammered, his heart pounding in his chest. But the damage was done. The silence at the table was deafening, the tension suffocating. His mother's wide eyes filled with tears, her hand clutching at the Mangalsutra around her neck, as though it might shield her from the truth. The days that followed were worse than any nightmare Naveen could have imagined. The message had been enough to ignite a wildfire of rumors among their extended family. Uncles and aunts called with thinly veiled accusations, their words dripping with judgment. His parents were relentless in their disappointment, their anger cutting deeper than any wound. "You've brought shame to this family," his father said one evening, his voice heavy with disgust. He refused to meet Naveen's eyes, as though even looking at him was unbearable. His mother sat in the corner of the room, her prayer beads clicking furiously as she muttered under her breath, tears streaming down her face. Naveen wanted to scream, to explain that love wasn't something he had chosen, that it wasn't something he could switch off like a light. But every time he opened his mouth, the weight of his parents' expectations and his own fear silenced him. He had never felt so alone. The only bright spot in the darkness was Priya, his younger sister. She found him one night sitting on the steps of their home, his head in his hands. Without saying a word, she sat beside him and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "You don't get to choose who you love by," she said softly, her voice steady and full of conviction. "But you do get to choose how much of yourself you're willing to lose for others. Don't let them take all of you." Her words stayed with him, a lifeline in the storm. But even as he clung to them, Naveen couldn't help but wonder how much more he could endure before he lost himself completely. Back in Norway, Elias struggled with the silence. The once lively hum of his daily life now felt oppressive, every tick of the clock a painful reminder of Naveen's absence. He sent messages that went unanswered, calls that went straight to voicemail. At first he reasoned that Naveen needed space, but as days turned into weeks, doubt began to creep in like an unwelcome guest. Was it something he'd said? Had he pushed too hard, expecting too much? The fear of losing Naveen gnawed at him, leaving him restless on long, sleepless nights. Elias threw himself into work, into hobbies, into anything that could distract him from the ache in his chest. But it didn't work. The silence from Naveen became louder than any distraction Elias could conjure. Each unanswered text felt like a door slamming shut. When Naveen finally returned to London months later, Elias barely recognized him. The vibrant, confident man he had fallen for was gone, replaced by a shadow of his former self. Elias had been overjoyed at the prospect of seeing him, but that joy was quickly eclipsed by concern. Naveen's smile didn't reach his eyes anymore, and his laughter, once rich and contagious, was now brittle, like glass ready to shatter. He avoided Elias's gaze, his hands fidgeting nervously as if he carried a weight too heavy to bear. Elias tried to bridge the gap, tried to coax Naveen back into the warmth they had once shared. He made Naveen's favorite meals, played their favorite music, even suggested revisiting the spots where their love had blossomed. But nothing worked. Naveen seemed perpetually on edge, like a man standing at the edge of a precipice, bracing for the fall. The breaking point came during a quiet dinner at Elias's apartment. The table was set with care, candles flickering softly, plates of Naveen's favorite dishes laid out in an attempt to rekindle a spark. They ate in near silence, the clinking of utensils the only sound in the room. Finally, Elias reached out, gently placing his hand over Naveen's. In an instant, Naveen recoiled as though Elias's touch had burned him, his face twisted with a mix of guilt and fear, his body trembling. Elias's heart sank. "What happened?" Elias demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "What did they do to you?" Naveen's composure crumbled. His confession came in a torrent of tears, his voice shaking with every word. "They disowned me, Elias. My father said he has no son. My mother—" He choked on the words, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though it might steady him. "She can't even look at me. I'm dead to them. Elias, I've lost everything." For a moment, the world stood still. Elias stared at Naveen, his chest tightening as he took in the raw pain etched into his lover's face. Without hesitation, he crossed the distance between them and pulled Naveen into a fierce embrace. Naveen collapsed into his arms, his sobs muffled against Elias's chest. "You haven't lost me," Elias whispered, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "You'll never lose me." Naveen clung to him like a lifeline, and in that moment, Elias vowed to be the anchor Naveen so desperately needed. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together. Their love became a series of stolen moments and whispered promises. Naveen struggled to reconcile his feelings for Elias with the weight of his family's rejection. Each time Elias reached for his hand in public, Naveen flinched, his eyes darting around as if the world might collapse upon them. At parties with Elias's friends, Naveen often lingered at the edges, nodding politely but never fully engaging. He felt like an intruder in their easy camaraderie, a ghost haunting a world he didn't belong to. Elias tried to be patient. He would spend hours reassuring Naveen, holding him close on the couch as they watched movies or cooked dinner together. But the strain was evident. Elias couldn't understand why Naveen seemed to retreat further into himself every time they made progress. One night, after an especially tense dinner party, Elias confronted him. "Do you even want to be with me?" he asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Naveen's eyes widened in shock. "How can you ask that? Of course I do." "Then why do I feel like I'm always dragging you into this relationship?" Elias shot back, his frustration spilling over. "Why can't you let yourself be happy?" Naveen's voice faltered. "Because every time I'm with you, I hear my father's words in my head. I see my mother's tears. I can't just turn that off, Elias." The words hung heavy between them, a chasm neither knew how to cross. They didn't speak for days after that fight, both retreating into their own pain. Elias threw himself into work, while Naveen spent hours wandering the city, lost in thought. The misunderstandings between them grew, fed by their silence. Elias mistook Naveen's reluctance to be open about their relationship as shame, a deep-seated embarrassment about being seen with him. Naveen, in turn, felt unworthy of Elias's love, convinced that he had brought nothing but pain into his life. The pressure built until it felt like a storm waiting to break. When Elias suggested the trip to the Norwegian mountains, Naveen agreed hesitantly. He wanted to fix things, to recapture the happiness they'd shared in the early days. But the weight of their unspoken fears and unresolved arguments came with them. The cabin was secluded and beautiful, surrounded by snow-covered pines and the soft glow of a winter sun. At first, the quiet seemed like a balm. They cooked together, hiked through the woods, and spent evenings curled up by the fireplace. But the tension was never far away. Naveen's gaze often drifted into the distance, and Elias's patience was wearing thin. One evening, as snow fell heavily outside, Naveen sat by the window, staring out at the white expanse. Elias joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Naveen didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm thinking about how much easier your life would be without me." Elias froze, his hand dropping away. "What are you talking about?" Naveen turned to him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You deserve someone braver than me, Elias. Someone who isn't afraid to love you the way you deserve." Elias's response was fierce and unwavering. "And you deserve someone who sees you for who you are, Naveen. All of you. I'm not going anywhere, not unless you tell me to." The raw honesty of his words shattered something inside Naveen. For the first time, he allowed himself to cry openly, releasing the pain and guilt he had been carrying for so long. Elias held him through it, whispering words of comfort and love until Naveen's sobs subsided. The days that followed were transformative, a slow unraveling of walls Naveen had spent years building around his heart. At first, his words came hesitantly, like a stream struggling to break free from ice. But as the night stretched on and Elias listened with unwavering patience, the dam began to break. Naveen shared pieces of himself he'd long buried, his childhood dreams of being a writer, his fears of disappointing his family, and the secret shame that had kept him from accepting his own desires. Elias, in turn, opened up in ways that surprised even himself. He talked about his own insecurities, the moments he'd doubted his worth, and how he had never quite fit into the mold his parents had envisioned for him. They spent hours wrapped in conversation, their words weaving a tapestry of understanding that brought them closer with every thread. For the first time in his life, Naveen felt seen, not just the parts he carefully curated to fit societal expectations, but the messy, vulnerable, and beautiful whole of him. He realized that his love for Elias wasn't a betrayal of his family or culture. It was an affirmation of his truth. Slowly, he began to embrace the idea that love wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to cherish. When they returned to London, reality pressed in with its sharp edges, but they faced it together. Naveen began taking tentative steps toward living authentically. He found his voice in small but significant ways, like correcting a co-worker's assumption about his relationship status or holding Elias's hand in a crowded park. One evening, Elias invited Naveen to a public event, a charity fundraiser where many of his closest friends would be. Naveen's heart raced at the thought of stepping into such a space, but when the night came, he surprised himself. He stood beside Elias, fingers interlaced, his nervousness tempered by the steady warmth of Elias's touch. As the evening unfolded, Naveen marveled at how Elias's friends welcomed him with open arms. When they raised their glasses to toast the couple, Naveen felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, not because he was trying to fit in, but because he was finally showing up as himself. Yet their journey was far from over. The ghost of Naveen's family's rejection lingered, casting long shadows over his newfound happiness. Society's judgment was an ever-present weight, one that threatened to crush the fragile hope he was beginning to nurture. But with Elias by his side, Naveen found the courage to keep moving forward. He began to envision a future he'd once thought impossible, a future where love and self-acceptance weren't mutually exclusive. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was real. As winter gradually surrendered to the promise of spring, their love blossomed like the first fragile buds breaking through the frost. It was complicated and imperfect, but it was theirs, and it was worth fighting for. As the seasons turned, the couple faced a series of trials that would challenge the strength of their bond. Naveen, seeking closure and the faint hope of reconciliation, decided to return to India briefly. Elias, though apprehensive, supported the decision, knowing how much Naveen longed to heal the rift with his family. In New Delhi, Naveen's presence was met with cold indifference from his father and restrained sorrow from his mother. Priya, as always, welcomed him with open arms. One evening, after much persuasion from Priya, Naveen's mother agreed to speak with him privately. The conversation was laden with pain and unspoken words. "You chose your path, Naveen," she said, her voice trembling. But you must understand that your father's anger is his way of mourning. He's grieving the son he thought he knew. But I'm still his son, Naveen replied, his voice cracking. I haven't changed. I just stopped pretending. Her gaze softened, and for the first time, she reached out to touch his hand. It will take time, she whispered, but I'll pray that he sees what I see, that your heart is still good. The visit was bittersweet, but it gave Naveen a sliver of hope. When he returned to London, he felt lighter, as if he had laid down a piece of the burden he carried. Elias noticed the change immediately and celebrated it with a quiet dinner at home. But life had more surprises in store. Naveen's work visa was suddenly called into question, throwing their future into uncertainty. The possibility of Naveen being forced to leave the UK weighed heavily on both of them. They sought legal advice, spent countless nights poring over documents, and leaned on Elias's network for support. Amid this turmoil, their love only grew stronger. Elias's unwavering support during the crisis reassured Naveen that their relationship wasn't just about passion, but also about partnership. Naveen, in turn, found a newfound courage to fight for their shared dreams. Eventually, after months of uncertainty, they received the news they had been praying for. Naveen's visa was approved. The email came on a quiet Tuesday morning, and for a moment, neither of them could quite believe it. Elias read the words out loud, his voice trembling, and when the realization sank in, Naveen dropped the coffee cup he was holding. The porcelain shattered, but they were too busy laughing and crying to care. That evening, they celebrated with a small gathering of friends at their favorite cafe. The air buzzed with excitement as laughter and clinking glasses filled the room. Naveen, usually reserved in public, felt a weight lifted from his chest. Surrounded by people who had supported them through thick and thin, he found a confidence he didn't know he possessed. When it was time for the toast, Elias nudged him gently. You should say something, he whispered, his eyes encouraging. Naveen hesitated, his palms sweaty, but then he stood up. He held his glass firmly, glancing at Elias before addressing the room. His voice, usually soft and cautious, carried a newfound steadiness. I've spent most of my life afraid, he began, the room falling silent. His gaze moved across the faces of their friends, lingering on Elias. Afraid of disappointing my family, of being judged by society, of losing everything. But being with Elias has taught me that love is worth fighting for. It's worth every risk, every moment of doubt, every tear. The words seemed to come from a deep place within him, a truth he had only recently come to embrace. There were times when I thought this day would never come, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. But here we are, and I know now that no matter how many obstacles stand in our way, love will always find a way. When he finished, there was a brief moment of stunned silence before the room erupted in applause. Naveen's friends cheered, some of them wiping away tears, while others clinked glasses and shouted words of encouragement. Elias, standing at his side, could barely hold back his own tears. His eyes met Naveen's, brimming with pride and an overwhelming love that words couldn't capture. He reached out, taking Naveen's hand and squeezed it tightly. I'm so proud of you, Elias whispered, his voice breaking. Naveen smiled, his heart full in a way it had never been before. For the first time he felt truly free, not just from the confines of bureaucracy, but from the fears that had held him back for so long. That night, as the celebration carried on around them, Naveen and Elias stood together, basking in the warmth of their friend's love and the promise of a future they could finally build without fear. It wasn't just a toast, it was the start of a new chapter, one they would write together.